A boy in Indiana, in 1913, is said to have turned 70 years old in just 1 week. This is the news that no one can ignore. He was no longer called a kid, but an old man with a body that was too young for him. His fate was described in one word: inbred. That word turned him from a patient into a symbol. His story was told in homes and written in newspapers as proof that genetic diseases can be dangerous. The most horrifying thing about this picture is not just the child falling over from old age, it also shows how people thought back then. They were ready to think that bloodlines could curse families overnight. Tonight, we're going to talk about the inbred boy who aged 70 years in a week and what it tells us about science, myth, and fear in the United States in the early 1900s. Where are you sitting to listen? If you want to read more stories like this every day, make sure to subscribe. Also, share your own family stories or neighborhood legends in the comments. Weird stories often start closer to home than we think. In Indiana newspapers in 1913, there were stories about a boy who was said to have aged 70 years in just 1 week. The headline of the story seemed too strange to be true. The wording was meant to get people's attention. It was an unusual claim that made people both curious and uneasy. In a time when print media was strongly competing for readers, such a big story could quickly go around and be told over and over again in homes and public places as if it were true. But the claim makes me wonder from the start. Could a medical issue explain why someone would change so much? Was there a real case, or was it something the press made up? And why did people at the time believe it so easily without asking for proof? The way it's written shows more about society than medicine. The word inbred was very important to the story. For people today, the word means genetic closeness between parents, but it had a different meaning in the early 1900s. It wasn't so much a scientific fact as a judgment. The word was used to describe degeneracy, weakness, and what people think will happen if they break social rules. By putting that word together with the frightening images of aging faster, newspapers made a morality tale that looked like a medical report. People were interested in the boy, but he was also seen as proof that genes could strike in dramatic and obvious ways. It's clear that the claim is false when you look at it through the lens of biology. Aging is a complicated process that includes DNA repair, cellular replication, metabolic control, and effects from the outside world. Even in rare diseases where these processes don't work right, changes happen over time, not all at once. Syndromes that look like getting older, like Hutchinson-Gilford progeria, show up over time and have a lot of research on them. There is no sickness that has ever been shown to turn decades into days. It can't happen because of how human biology is built. Medical schools at the time would have kept records of such a change, but there are none other than sensational newspaper clippings. Another truth that comes out of the story's persistence is that in 1913 traditional norms, not scientific ones, were used to judge how plausible something was. Readers were already used to hearing about strange illnesses, amazing recoveries, and strange body changes. It was common for popular newspapers to blur the line between fun and fact, putting more emphasis on spectacle than accuracy. A child who aged quickly made for interesting reading, and when it was explained as bad heredity, it added to people's fears about the risks of being related. It didn't have to be scientifically correct, it just had to fit with people's worries at the time. The historical background gives important information. By this time, Indiana was already a center of the growing eugenics movement. In 1907, the state passed the first law in the US that required people to get sterilized. The law caused a lot of discussion and attention across the country. People were talking about the idea that genes could determine social worth all the time by 1913. In that light, a story about a boy who was inbred and would have an impossible fate wasn't seen as silly. A story that seemed to prove that close family relationships could have terrible bodily effects was taken as proof. This frame brings up more serious issues. Why did these claims have weight even though there was no proof for them? Was it a lack of medical knowledge or a society that wanted to believe that genes determined fate? Why didn't any doctors from the time officially dispute the story if it was actually going around in print? What real child or family, if any, was behind the made-up story? This may be the most important question. The full facts may never be found, but the headline shows what people were afraid of and what they believed at the time. The story about the boy who supposedly aged 70 years in a week may not have been true, but it tells us a lot about how people thought about genetics, family, and social order in the early 1900s. It shows how sensational news can turn medically impossible things into cultural truths, and how language can turn a child into a symbol. The story wasn't just about a boy, it was about a society that was trying to figure out new ideas about inheritance and was looking for dramatic proof of its worries. In 1913, people used the word inbred to describe someone, but it was more of a cultural opinion than a scientific one. The correct science term for this is consanguinity, which means marriage between people who are related biologically, usually as second cousins or closer. Because they are together, there is a greater chance that their children will have two exact copies of a recessive gene variant. In real life, this means that if a rare genetic condition is quietly passed down through a family, there is a slightly higher chance that it will show up in the next generation if the parents are connected. Still, it's important to remember that being related does not cause new changes or sudden terrible events. In the context of transmission, it only changes the odds. But at the start of the 20th century, this difference was not always clear. The word inbred was often used to mean something weak, strange, or even morally wrong. It meant that something strange had happened, that the parents had crossed a line, and that bad things were going to happen that were sure to happen. When the word was used in the news, it wasn't in the sense that scientists knew it. It was a loaded cultural symbol. Fears about decline and degeneration were echoed by the word inbred, which boiled down complicated biological processes into a single charge. The growing impact of eugenics thought made the social stigma surrounding being related even worse. People still didn't fully understand Mendelian genetics, which had only recently been found, but there were a lot of simple ideas going around about how genes work. People thought that traits would be passed on smoothly from one generation to the next, with little room for chance or difference. From that point of view, it made sense to blame consanguinity for any strange medical or developmental problem. People quickly assumed that a family was inbred if a child had traits that were not typical for their family. Because they thought this was the case, they didn't have to look into any other possibilities, like genetic, environmental, or just random causes. Later, scientific studies would show that the risks of being related are real, but not nearly as bad as the propaganda said they were. It is normal for children to have a 2–3% chance of having a major birth defect. The total chance goes up by about 2 percentage points for children of first cousins, making it 4 or 5%. Even though that rise is big, it doesn't mean disaster is certain. A lot of homes with children have kids who are completely healthy. The idea that these kinds of unions would always lead to terrible or gross results is based on stereotypes rather than facts. But in Indiana, in 1913, the word inbred had such social weight that it could make a story seem true just by being in the title. The story from Indiana shows how this stigma worked. The newspaper turned the child's alleged condition into a morality story by calling him inbred. It wasn't said that the person was aging quickly as a medical mystery, but as proof of what can happen when genes aren't handled properly. The plot of the story made it seem like nature was striking parents for being too close. This fit with the stories people told at the time, which said that biology was both a law and a moral power. It also made people feel like they had some control over their lives. If degeneration was caused by inbreeding, then society could stop it by controlling marriage and having children. You can't undervalue the power of words to change how people think and feel. When you say something about a child being inbred, you take away his uniqueness and use him as an example. If the same child had been talked about in terms of a genetic disorder or a medical report, people might have been interested or felt sorry for them. People called him inbred, and he turned into a danger sign instead of a person. Language did more than just describe things. It also shaped how families were treated, how laws were explained, and how people thought about inheritance. This way, the Indiana story wasn't really about one child, but about what the word inbred means in different cultures. This naturally makes you wonder how language still affects how we see things. Why do words that come from shame still be used long after science has moved on to more accurate words? How many families had to deal with social criticism because people thought illness was a sign of bad genes? In 1913, it was hard to tell the difference between describing something and criticizing it. The word inbred blurred that line, making complicated biology seem simple, even if it was not. It changed how people saw it, and it made it harder to see how simple and likely consanguinity really is. Even a simple look at human biology shows that the claim that a child could turn 70 years old in just 1 week is not true. The aging process is not a single event, but a series of events that happen over time and are caused by things like cell damage, metabolic control, genetic stability, and exposure to the environment. It takes time for things to change, even when these systems break down. It takes months, years, and even decades to play out, not just a few days. In medical science, a quick change in the body that looks like old age has never been seen, and no known disorder allows for such a change to happen. It helps to know how cellular aging works in order to understand why. Cells copy themselves by dividing, and each cycle gives mistakes a chance to happen in the DNA copying. The protective ends of chromosomes, called telomeres, get shorter over time. This limits the number of cycles a cell can go through. Damage builds up on proteins, repair systems get weaker, and cells lose their ability to grow back. All of these changes happen slowly and add up over time, which is how we know that age works. When these processes don't work right, like in progeroid conditions, the rate of change speeds up, but it still stays within the limits of biology. The body doesn't jump decades at once. It moves in a way that can be tracked and studied. The most well-known case is Hutchinson-Gilford progeria, a condition in which kids start to age faster than they should within their first 2 years. They have slow growth, hair loss, thin skin, and heart disease, all of which are symptoms that are usually found in much older people. But years are still used to measure how fast things change. Kids with progeria can live into their early to mid-teens or even their 20s. There has never been a case like the one in Indiana, which took decades to solve in just 1 week. The difference between what doctors say and what the newspaper says shows how sensationalism has taken the place of truth. The times for other progeroid disorders are also similar. Werner syndrome, which is also known as adult progeria, usually shows up in youth or early adulthood. It causes hair to gray too quickly, cataracts, and a higher risk of getting cancer. Both mandibular coccygeal dysplasia and Cockayne syndrome have symptoms that look like age, but they both get worse over time. All of these conditions have one thing in common: they slow down biological processes, but don't stop them totally. They are still tied to time, even if the string is cut shorter. The thought that you can live 70 years in 7 days is not only wrong, it goes against everything we know about life at the cellular and systemic levels. This impossibility shows that the story from 1913 wasn't really news but rather a metaphor. For the public, it wasn't important that the story match up with medical facts. What mattered was the picture it made, a striking example of justice passed down through generations. The boy, whether he was real or made up, was a sign of what could happen when families didn't follow the rules of family relationships. That picture stuck with people longer than any medical explanation could, because it played on feelings instead of facts. In a culture where genetics were seen as more and more like fate, the claim's lack of credibility did not lessen its power. There would still be proof of such a case if it had really happened. The amazing change would have been written down by hospitals, coroners, or medical papers. In the early 1900s, doctors paid close attention to rare diseases, and a child with symptoms that had never been seen before would have gotten a lot of attention from more than just local media. Still, there is no record other than wild news stories. The claim itself is telling, but the lack of proof is even more telling. It makes me think that either the story was way too dramatic about a real but more slow problem, or it was a complete lie meant to catch people's attention. The next question is why people thought it was true. The culture willingness to accept family horror stories is the key. Biology was a new area of science that most people didn't know much about, and the newspaper made it easy to understand what was unknown. A child who had a strange disease could be explained by genetics, and the story was made more realistic to teach a lesson. People didn't ask if it was possible to age so quickly. They asked what it meant about morals, genetics, and the risks of being related. The story went around scientific plausibility because it fit with what people expected to see. 70 years in a week is not possible, which shows the difference between science and stories. In terms of medicine, it can't happen. In terms of culture, it didn't have to happen for it to be important. The boy became a way to talk about worries about genes. The story was told over and over again not because it was true, but because it was useful. There is no evidence for such a change in the scientific record, but the headline lives on as a reminder of how quickly fear, ignorance, and cultural agendas can change what seems plausible. When people think about the Indiana news story, Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome is the first thing that comes to mind. It is the most well-known disorder linked to aging faster. Progeria is a very rare genetic disorder that was first discovered by Dr. Jonathan Hutchinson and Dr. Hastings Gilford in a few children in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It was given its name after these doctors. It is usually caused by a single letter change in the LMNA gene. This gene codes for lemon A, a structural protein that cells need to keep their nucleus envelopes intact. This mutation makes a protein called progerine that isn't supposed to be there. It damages cells all over the body and makes nuclei less stable. It's important to note that this condition doesn't usually come from genetics in the usual way. Geneticists call these new changes de novo mutations. They cause most cases. Most of the time, parents of children with the disorder don't have any symptoms themselves, and the disorder has no effect on their family history. This trend makes a very important point clear. Progeria is not caused by being related to someone who has it. Some culture stories from the early 1900s blamed progeria on inbreeding, which shows that people didn't understand how genetic mutations happen. As far as we know, the condition is almost always caused by a sad accident of biology and not a flaw that was passed down from parents. The signs and symptoms of progeria are unique and often easy to spot. Babies usually look healthy when they are born, but their growth slows down in the first year or two. Hair loss starts early, and then the skin's appearance changes, making it look thin and old. With a small mouth, a pinched nose, and big eyes, the face starts to look like someone else's. Even with these changes, most kids are still smart, and a lot of them are still busy and social. Heart problems like narrowing of the arteries happen more often as they get bigger, which can cause heart attacks or strokes before they should. Lifespan has dropped a lot, but with medical help, some children have lived into their 20s in modern times. When you know more about progeria, you can see how far from science the Indiana story was. The problem doesn't lead to sudden changes. Parents notice changes over months and years, not days, because the symptoms show up slowly. To try to fit the progression of progeria into a week would not only go against everything we know about medicine, but also every case that has been reported. This is why the story can't be seen as a mirror of progeria itself. Instead, it was a lie, exaggeration, or fabrication meant to make people afraid of genetic decline. The record of the past shows that doctors who wrote about progeria never linked it to being related. Instead, They carefully recorded how it happened on its own in families that were otherwise normal. Still, the link was often made in newspapers and everyday because it served a culture purpose. Connecting the disease to inbreeding made a moral case easy to make. It helped people see illness not as an unpredictable part of biology, but as a result of decisions, which boosted the idea that genes could be managed, controlled, and policed. Given the political and social climate of eugenics in Indiana in 1913, this way of putting things would have seemed normal and even convincing to readers. This misunderstanding keeps going around, which shows how ideology can get in the way of medical information. When science language is used in everyday speech, it is often sped up or changed to fit what people already believe. People thought that progeria, a rare and terrible disease caused by a random gene, showed how dangerous it is to be related to someone. Even though the boy who was said to have aged 70 years in a week probably had little to do with progeria, the story used images from the illness to make its point. This made it hard to tell the difference between science and a story, changing genetic chance into a warning about inheritance. The difference between what scientists know about progeria and what people think about it as inbred is very clear. In science, progeria is an example of how mutations can happen without warning. It shows how a single change at the molecular level can change how a person grows and develops over their lifetime. In society, it became a sign of inherited decay, which made people feel bad about themselves instead of helping them understand. For example, the Indiana story shows how facts can be changed to fit cultural fears and how rare events can be used for bigger political goals. When looked at from a medical point of view, the way progeria gets worse shows why the Indiana news could never have been a true story. Most babies born with Hutchinson-Gilford progeria look fine at birth. There might not be many signs that something is wrong in the first few months of life. It's not until after the first year that differences become clear. The child stays much smaller than their peers, even though they are getting enough food. Growth slows down and weight gain stops. Loss of hair starts early and usually starts on the head. Later, it spreads to the eyebrows and eyelashes. By early childhood, the symptoms of the condition become more obvious. A thin nose, a small mouth, eyes that stick out, and skin that looks tight and old. These outward traits are joined by slow changes happening inside. Children with progeria lose muscle and fat, which makes them look weak. Their bones become abnormal, their joints become stiff, and they may dislocate their hips or have teeth come in later than expected. Patches of thickening skin that looks like scleroderma may appear, making it look even older than it really is. Even so, brain development stays normal, and kids usually have fun personalities and are interested in the world around them. For more than 100 years, doctors have written about how these people look and act like they are still young, which shows that the disease only affects the body and not the mind. Heart disease becomes the most important and dangerous factor as kids get older. Atherosclerosis, which is when arteries get hard, usually happens to older adults, starts to show up in early children in progeria. This makes the chances of having a heart attack, stroke, or heart failure higher. A lot of kids with this condition die between the ages of 5 and 11. Some make it to their 20s. In recent years, progress in medicine, such as the study of farnesyltransferase inhibitors and other targeted therapies, has slightly increased life expectancy, but the disease is still fatal. The most surprising thing, though, is that the disease lasts for years, not weeks. The Indiana headline ignored this fact in favor of making a show. For people who are used to reading about strange medical things, the idea of a child slowly showing signs of aging would not have been enough to shock readers. As soon as it was said that the change happened in just 1 week, the story became something extraordinary that stood out in a crowded media market. But by doing that, it changed the very nature of the disease it was referring to. There was already a lot of sadness in the story of progeria without adding to it. but adding to it served a cultural purpose by making people worry about their genes while selling papers. The real story of how progeria got started shows how false information can spread. Families dealing with the condition in the early 1900s would have seen changes over time but not have had a good scientific reason. Genetic testing wasn't available, and doctors didn't know a lot about diseases. People who see this kind of child might get the signs wrong, or a writer might make them sound worse to make a story about how quickly the child is falling apart. It might be hard to tell the difference between observation and invention if there aren't any clinical details. The story that came out of it worked better as a parable than as an account of a real medical situation. The difference between fact and fiction shows how science details can be lost when they are shared with the public. Progeria is rare, gets worse over time, and is sad, but it never happens all at once. When put up against clinical proof, Indiana's story of 70 years in a week falls apart. Still, the story's longevity shows how a shocking story can stick around even when biology says otherwise. It gave people easy-to-understand answers, confirmed traditional fears, and brought genetics to life in a way that science could never do. This makes me wonder about how people socially and medically understand conditions like progeria. Did families feel the weight of shame when people thought a child's sickness was a punishment passed down from parent to child? Did the news stories that spread that shame make it seem like a rare genetic chance was bound to happen? We still don't know the answers, but the Indiana case tells us that how we think about a disease is affected by the stories we hear about it, just as much as the disease itself. In this way, the myth of sudden change overshadowed the slow development of progeria, leaving a legacy that was more based on cultural imagination than medical truth. In 1913, a story about a boy turning 70 years old in a week got a lot of attention in Indiana. To understand why, it's important to look at the social and political climate of the time. Indiana wasn't just another state with strange medical stories. It was the center of the early American eugenics movement. 6 years before the story, in 1907, Indiana passed the first law in the country that required people to get sterilized. People who were deemed unfit to reproduce, such as those with mental illness, epilepsy, or a criminal record, could be sterilized under this law. Even though it was later changed and fought, the law set a standard, and by 1913, other states had passed laws that were similar. The weather in Indiana seemed to encourage stories that seemed to confirm the idea of genetic decline. This law's passing was more than just a matter of policy. It was part of a larger idea that fate was determined by genes. More and more, reformers, doctors, and politicians looked at social problems like poverty, crime, and illness through the lens of biology. People or families who were having trouble were told it was because of bad heredity. In this view, stories about disasters that are passed down through families were not crazy, they were expected. A child who was said to be rapidly and horribly deteriorating due to inbreeding wasn't seen as a medical oddity, but as a live example of the dangers that eugenicists warned about. In Indiana, the eugenics movement wasn't just in the courts. It was talked about in churches, schools, and public health efforts. People were told in lectures and pamphlets that inherited weakness could weaken the state. Families were told to be responsible for their lineage, and it was seen as risky for cousins or people from groups that were thought to be closed off to get married. This kind of rhetoric made it easy for sensational news to thrive. A title about a child who was inbred and aged so much in a week fit right into a story that people already believed. It made the effects of breaking genetic rules more dramatic, which supported both the law for removal and the eugenic message as a whole. The year 1913 is also important because it was during this time that the American eugenics movement became more official. Other states were influenced by Indiana's law, and by the middle of the 1910s, abortion laws were becoming more popular across the country. Often promises that these steps would save money, improve public health, or stop crime were used to back them up. In this situation, news stories about genetic decline weren't just interesting, they were used to make a point. They gave vivid, if not scientific, examples that could be used as proof in public platforms and legislative debates that something needed to be done. Newspapers helped connect people who read science writing with people who didn't. Not many people could read medical books directly, and even fewer could understand what it meant. What they did read were headlines and articles that boiled down complicated problems into harsh warnings. It was more interesting to talk about a boy who seemed to age 70 years in a week than to talk about recessive inheritance or genetic change in general. It painted a picture in readers' minds that could stand in for bigger worries. Some readers may not have taken the story at face value, but it served as a metaphor, highlighting the idea that inheritance was weak and dangerous if not handled properly. The situation in Indiana shows how science misunderstanding, sensational journalism, and the push for laws all came together. The boy's story wasn't just made up. It was backed up by a society that was used to seeing genetic disaster everywhere. It met a need even if it was made up or overstated. The public could see that the rule on sterilization was not only reasonable but also necessary. It gave them confidence that the government was acting against the alleged threats of genetic decline. In this way, the story was formed by its surroundings as well as by the writers and editors who worked on it. When we look back, we can see that the boy in the headline from 1913 wasn't really a medical case. He was more of a culture symbol. He showed how people felt about family, inheritance, and how fragile society is in a time of fast change. It was impossible for him to change, but the lesson he taught fit perfectly with the goals of Indiana's politicians and reformers. Because of eugenics, this kind of story would not only be written but also be believed. This spread the harmful idea that biology could be controlled by rules, laws, and punishments. In the years before 1913, eugenics ideas spread from lawmakers and courtrooms to everyday life. The rise of Better Babies contests was one of the clearest signs of this change. At first glance, these competitions, which were often held at state fairs in the Midwest, including Indiana's, looked like fun events to promote kid health. Parents would bring in their babies, who were then checked out by doctors and nurses and given scores based on a number of physical and behavioral factors. The healthiest kids got ribbons or awards, and their families were proud that their kids were being seen as healthy role models. But these events were really about a set of ideas that were very similar to eugenics. These ideas said that heredity was something that could be measured, compared, and was at the heart of social worth. Public health reformers and women's clubs often pushed the Better Babies events, saying that getting parents to follow medical advice would lower the death rate for babies. During a time when many young people died from diseases and bad nutrition, this was not an unimportant factor. But the score sheets that were used in these competitions show that there was another plan. Babies were judged on more than just their weight, length, and signs of good care. They were also judged on their proportions, facial features, and general look, all of which were based on ideas of what was fit in a family. Families that did well were shown to be from good stock, while families that did poorly were clearly marked as less desired. Newspapers were very excited about the contests and ran stories about the winning babies and their families along with photos of the kids. The contest's message got stronger, that genes could and should be tested, and that society could tell the difference between fit and unfit people. The reasoning was similar to the moral lesson in the Indiana news story about the inbred boy. The headline showed a horrible picture of genetic decline, and the events showed a nice picture of genetic success. They all supported the same story, that fate was decided by genes, and that it was society's job to support the strong and shame the weak. The language of genetics became more common among regular people because of these events. It was hard to tell the difference between biological ranking and health promotion when babies were compared in the same way that animals were judged at agricultural shows. People who may never have been to a legislative meeting on sterilization laws learned about eugenics at the state fair, which was a familiar place for them. All the time people talked about better stock and improvement, and ribbons and medals gave the events an air of legitimacy. When things were like this, the shocking Indiana headline seemed less like a grotesque lie and more like a warning about the risks the contests were supposed to protect against. There were events for more than just babies. By the 1920s, they had changed into fitter families contests, where whole families were judged. In addition to health, these tests also included morals, work ethic, and how smart someone was thought to be. Families that were seen as good examples were praised in public, while families that were seen as lacking were gently criticized. The bigger the contests got, the broader eugenics became. It went from worrying about the survival of babies to making big claims about the biological fate of whole societies. People in this system thought that genetics wasn't just a family matter, it was a public matter that could be judged, ranked, and changed. There were big effects on society from these events. They told people to think of heredity in stark terms of success and failure, and to see health and illness as signs of family history instead of luck or situation. They also made stigma stronger, making families with kids who were sick, disabled, or looked different feel like they were under a lot of public criticism. So a story like the one in the headline in 1913 wasn't an outlier. It was part of the same culture puzzle. It had the same goal as the contests, to make the risks of inherited weakness seem more real and to spread the idea that genes could be fixed by being careful and in charge. Looking back, the Better Baby events show how eugenic ideas spread not only in schools but also in everyday life. They turned public health into a show and genetics into a race, teaching people to believe even the most unbelievable stories as long as they fit into the bigger story. The story of the boy who supposedly turned 70 years old in a wood didn't have to be true for it to be important. What was important was that it proved what many people already thought, that inheritance was fragile and that going against the rules had terrible results. To see how the Indiana news story was wrong, we need to take a close look at what changes in genetic transfer when people are related and what stays the same. People who are biologically connected, usually first or second cousins, can get married. This is called consanguinity. People who are related share more genetic material than people who are not related. This means that their children are more likely to get exact copies of a recessive variant that has been passed down quietly through the family. This statistical overlap makes it more likely that a rare genetic trait will show up, but it doesn't cause new mutations or make sure bad things will happen. It is possible to measure the level of risk. In the general community, there is a 2 to 3% chance of having a child with a serious birth defect. The risk goes up by about 2 percentage points for first cousins, hitting 4 to 5%. The risk is higher for close relationships like uncle and daughter or double first cousins, but it's still possible and not a given. These numbers are important because they show how small the rise really is. Even though the risks are big enough that modern medicine offers genetic advice, they are not nearly as bad as the fear-mongering makes them sound. Consanguinity does not, however, lead to quick or unbelievable changes. It doesn't make a child turn 70 years old in a week, and it doesn't make things happen that aren't possible in nature. Instead, it makes diseases more likely that are already present in a family's genes. Most of the time, these problems get worse over time, affecting growth, metabolism, or certain organ systems. By using the word inbred to describe a medical claim that didn't make sense, the Indiana headline replaced science with exaggeration, making a small statistical rise in risk into a show of hereditary breakdown. This distortion shows how words can change how we understand things. The science term, consanguinity, refers to genetic relatedness and is not biased. As a cultural word, inbred, however, is very harsh. It makes inheritance seem like something that will happen anyway, is weak, or will eventually break down. Even more weight was given to the term in Indiana in the early 1900s, where eugenics was already popular. It let newspapers and activists use individual illnesses as warning signs for the whole group, showing that inherited risk was real and dangerous. The readers were not told to think about chances, they were told to believe in sure. There were big social effects when people exaggerated the risks of being related. Families that were thought to have children with people from other families were shamed, and their children's illnesses were blamed on genetics, no matter what the cause was. People in a community might think that any strange appearance, disability, or rare sickness is proof of degeneration. This supported eugenic reasons for controlling marriage and having children, which were already making progress in Indiana's politics and culture. The moral story was more important than the simple scientific fact. Genetics today gives us a clearer view. There may be a higher rate of recessive conditions in places where cousin marriage is widespread, but most children are still healthy. Genetic therapy now helps families understand and deal with their risks, which shifts the focus from shame to making smart choices. This change shows how far from the truth the Indiana title was. By making family ties seem like a surefire way to go down a horrible road of degeneration, the story blew up both the chances and the effects, trading scientific detail for moral spectacle. When we look back, it's clear that the boy who was said to have turned 70 years old in a week was less of a medical case and more of a culture warning. People already knew what he was talking about, that being related to someone was dangerous, that inheritance was weak, and that going against social rules would be punished by biology. But from a scientific point of view, the risks are small, easy to measure, and not nearly as scary as the story made them sound. There is a difference between what changes because of consanguinity and what doesn't change. This difference is like the difference between biology and myth. When thinking about the story of the child in Indiana who reportedly turned 70 years old in a week, it is helpful to look at the real medical conditions that can cause symptoms similar to aging too quickly. Even though these diseases are rare, often recessive, and develop slowly, people who don't know much about science might get the wrong idea from what they look like. They show that biology can make things look like they are getting older, but never at the impossible rate that was claimed in the title. One of these is mandibulo-acral dysplasia, which is typically caused by changes in the LMNA or ZMPST24 genes. This condition causes kids to grow slowly, have problems with their bones, and have thin skin, which makes them look like they might be getting older. They might lose bone in their jaws, get a narrow face, and have trouble moving their joints, which can make them look old and weak even when they are young. But these changes happen over years, not days, and the kids' minds are still normally functioning otherwise. Before genetics was fully known in the early 1900s, this kind of condition might have been seen as a sign of inherited weakness, or even made up as a story of aging faster than usual. Xeroderma pigmentosum is a DNA repair problem that makes people very sensitive to ultraviolet light. It has signs that look like aging. Even short periods of time in the sun can cause burns, freckling, and early skin cancers in kids who are affected. Over time, the skin gets thin, wrinkled, and scarred, which can make a person look older than they really are. This disease is recessive, so it happens more often in places where family ties are strong, but only when both parents have the same rare variant. In 1913, people who weren't trained to see such changes might have thought the child was aging too quickly. But the real cause is a problem with DNA repair. Another example is Cockayne disease. This disorder mixes not growing, being sensitive to light, and brain damage. Kids' faces can look like those of older people, making them look thin, weak, and small. The worst part about Cockayne syndrome is that it gets worse slowly over years of growth setbacks. In a time when medicine didn't have many answers, it could have been mistaken for a strange inherited illness. Bloom syndrome is marked by short growth, skin problems, and a higher risk of getting cancer. Some of the visual signs of Bloom syndrome are also common with getting older. All of these factors can change how something looks in ways that people who don't know much about science might get wrong. What these conditions have in common is not quick change, but slow growth. As the child grows, more and more of their traits show, making a clear difference between their chronological age and how they look. In families or groups that were already aware of eugenics rhetoric, these kinds of differences were often blamed on genes and, more specifically, being related. Even though the link may have been random in many cases, the way people in that culture saw it was always the same. A strange appearance was seen as proof of genetic decline. This misunderstanding caused real problems in society. Families whose children have rare diseases may be looked down upon or shunned. People were told to think of sickness as a punishment passed down through families instead of something random or complicated by biology. This trend can be seen in the Indiana headline. Even if there was a kid in the area at the time with a recessive disorder, his condition would have been blown out of proportion and turned into a story about how quickly he aged, meant to scare people instead of being true. From today's point of view, these recessive disorders show how complicated biology can be and how simple cultural perception can be. The research reveals a slow but steady development, clear mechanisms, and a likelihood-based inheritance. Instead, people in Indiana in the early 1900s saw signs of decay, and examples of what could happen when biological and social lines were crossed. In this way, real medical conditions were used to make up myths, even if the myths had little to do with medical truth. The difference makes it clear why the story of 70 years in a week stuck around even though it was impossible. People already had fears about it, and it matched the clear but poorly understood signs of real genetic conditions. There is a difference in scale. Recessive diseases can change how people look in ways that look like they are getting older, but they never turn decades into days. These facts were skewed by the Indiana headline, which turned slow biological facts into an impossible show that showed culture bias more than medical fact. The fact that the Indiana story has stuck around for so long is linked to how newspapers worked in the early 1900s. In 1913, there was a lot of competition between local and regional papers. A lot of the time, circulation, not truth, was used to measure how successful a paper was. People bought more copies of stories that shocked, amazed, or worried them than stories that were just normal. In this setting, lying was not only normal, it was expected. A child turning 70 years old in a week was just the kind of story that could get people's attention, even if it wasn't based on any medical facts. That made a private disaster, real or imagined, into a show for everyone. The steps used to make news stories added to this outcome. Reporters often relied on gossip, rumors, or stories that doctors and people in the community told them. Not many stories were checked out very carefully, mostly when they were about rare illnesses that neither the editors nor the viewers knew much about. The ideas of genetics and inbreeding made it easy to talk about these things, and they fit in with the eugenics talk that was already going around. This is how the press not only showed cultural worries but also made them stronger by using isolated cases or made-up cases to warn people about the risks of inheriting traits. The sensationalism also shows how people were interested in medical secrets. At a time when scientists didn't know much, people looked to media to find out what was going on with strange and unfamiliar things. It was easier to understand a grotesque change caused by inbreeding than a technical talk about genetic mutations or rare conditions. The story showed inheritance in a dramatic way and taught readers a moral lesson while also being medically impossible. Many people already thought that genes could be bad, that being close to family was risky, and that society should be afraid of bad stock. The quickness with which these stories spread shows how people generally read news. In living rooms, train stations, and workplaces, newspapers competed for readers' interest. People liked stories that made people think, even if they weren't always true. That part was perfect for a story about a disaster that runs in the family. It was easy to tell again and again, didn't need a lot of science knowledge, and spoke to people's worries at the time. It didn't matter that there was no proof because the picture it created, a child turning into an old person in a week, was so powerful. The attraction of these kinds of stories also has to do with how we think about fear. People are interested in stories that make danger seem worse than it really is, especially when they confirm their own worries. At that time, eugenics laws were in place and heredity was being closely studied, so people were led to think that biology could severely punish wrongdoing. This was what people thought would happen because the title gave them both a story and a warning. Even if readers thought the story was embellished, the main point, that genetics could lead to terrible outcomes was still strong. So the role of the press in creating myths was just as important as the specifics of the story. By running these kinds of headlines, newspapers did more than just report the news, they also built culture stories. They taught people how to understand sickness, difference, and bad luck. They made stigmas stronger and policies more acceptable by doing this. The headline from Indiana makes this process very clear. The story did what it was supposed to do, which was to show how dangerous it is to be related and to support the logic of eugenics. Since there are no medical records to back up the story, it seems possible that it was either made up or a huge exaggeration of a real but slowly getting worse condition. However, the lack of real support did not stop it from striking a chord. In fact, the fact that it seemed impossible may have made it more powerful, making it memorable enough to stick around long after other stories had died down. This story shows how news stories can change cultural memory even after people have forgotten the specifics. What was left was the link between inbreeding and disaster, which lasted longer than the story itself. In this way, the Indiana story wasn't the only one. In the US and other countries, reporters often lied or exaggerated about stories of genetic decline, medical oddities, and horrifying changes. Each one did the same thing, which was to get people's attention, play on cultural fears, and turn complicated medical facts into easy-to-understand moral lessons. Part of this trend was the story of a boy who aged 70 years in a week. This is another example of how sensational journalism can create myths that people believe even though they are scientifically impossible. The word inbred is one of the best examples of how the way people talk about genetics shapes how they understand it. The label, which boils down complicated genetic facts into a single opinion, is both vague and offensive. To say that someone is inbred is not to talk about their biology, but to suggest that they are weak, strange, or corrupt. It makes families less human by using them as warning signs instead of as real people dealing with health and chance. The science word consanguinity, on the other hand, is not biased. It talks about how biologically related parents are to each other without giving moral weight to the information. This difference is important because the words used affect whether genetics talks are based on science or are filled with shame. In Indiana in the early 1900s, the word inbred had cultural weight even though it wasn't based on science. It gave newspapers and reformers a way to turn inherited danger into a moral story that made families look like they had done something wrong. If a child had a strange illness, it turned into proof of decline instead of a patient who needed care. The way it was said changed biology into a verdict. In this way, words were used to control society and supported eugenic ideas that tried to split people into groups of fit and unfit people. Newspapers made sure that readers understood not only the story, but also the moral lesson that was meant to be learned from it by repeating the word. The fact that this kind of wording is still used shows how stigma is spread. Families that were called inbred were judged by the society, even if their children's illnesses had nothing to do with being related. One word could explain away rare conditions, which stopped people from wanting to know about other reasons. This simplification made things easier for a society that wanted to keep clear lines between unions that were accepted and those that were not. Chance events, spontaneous mutations, and random differences could be ignored in favor of a story that supported biases that were already in place. With scientific knowledge, you can see things from a different angle. Consanguinity can make recessive diseases more likely, but it doesn't always mean what will happen. A lot of homes with close blood ties have healthy kids, risk ranges, and is affected by certain genetic variations, the history of a group, and random events. In modern genetics, the focus is on chance and variety, which paints a more complex picture than the word inbred suggests. However, nuance rarely makes the news. It was easier for simpler stories with bad guys, punishments, and warnings to get around, even if they were not true. It's not a small difference between reputation and science. Language that makes people feel bad about themselves can push families apart, keep them from getting medical care, and support policies that are too invasive. Clear, neutral words can help people understand, empathize, and make smart decisions. The type of words used in the Indiana headline turned what was meant to be a medical event into a cultural allegory. The boy was no longer a patient, but a reminder of what can happen when a mistake is passed down through generations. Instead, using science language would have led to more questions about diagnosis, progression, and treatment, which could have helped people understand better instead of making them more afraid. People still talk about heredity in ways that are affected by this strain between science and social norms. When people talked about eugenics, words like tainted bloodline or bad stock were popular. They sound a lot like the reasoning behind why inbred was so powerful in 1913. They make people into genetic stereotypes and don't let them be complicated. Modern medicine, on the other hand, is more concerned with processes, chances, and treatments. Instead of seeing families as moral failures, it sees them as partners in dealing with danger. The headline from Indiana shows how quickly language can change how we think about things. With just one word, biology can become morals. When you think about this past, it brings up questions that go beyond 1913. Another question is how many other families were judged based on the words used to describe them instead of the facts. How many kids were turned into icons instead of being seen as real people? And how often do words still affect how people understand genetics today, even though the science has moved on from simple terms? Even though the Indiana story didn't make sense, the language used in it had real power, and that power can still be felt in how people talk about, argue, and misunderstand inheritance. Putting heredity into numbers is one of the best ways to make it less mysterious, since numbers show chance rather than certainty. Genetics is basically the study of how features are likely to be passed down from one generation to the next. Each parent gives half of their DNA, and when they are put together, they make a new mix. When the parents are not connected, there is only a small amount of overlap between their gene sets. The overlap is bigger when they are connected, and the chance of matching on rare recessive variants goes up. Scientists use the inbreeding coefficient to talk about this. It is a number that shows how much genetic material is shared between parents. 1/16 of the time, first cousins are related to each other. In other words, about 6.25% of the child's genome is likely to be the same because they share a shared ancestor. In real life, this means that the chance of serious birth defects goes up by about 2 percentage points, from about 3% to 5%. The number is higher for unions between uncles and nieces, or between double first cousins, which shows that the genetic ties are stronger. Still, the numbers are still low enough that many children of these unions can be fully healthy. These odds show the difference between the real risk and the overstated certainty that comes from culture stories. There was no mention of odds in the Indiana title because odds don't sell newspapers. Instead, it gave readers the false impression that disaster was inevitable, that inbreeding would always lead to disaster, and that the disaster could be huge, happen right away, and be horrifying. Things are not what they seem to be. They show that even though the risk is high, it is not always high and never lines up with impossible results, like getting old quickly. When you look at inheritance mathematically, you can see a small, manageable trend, not a huge jump. Because the headline didn't look at the facts, it turned genetics into morality and chance into punishment. Numbers also show that randomness is a part of all families, even those that are not linked. Each couple has more than one recessive version, but most of them don't say anything, because there is only one copy. When luck is on your side, two carriers can pass on the same variant, creating a recessive disease. This can happen to couples who are not related, but the chances are lower for couples who are connected. You could say that genetics is less about fate and more about statistics. When people realize this, the talk changes from judging to understanding, and from shame to well-informed awareness. This change can be seen in modern therapy. Genetic experts help families understand their specific risks by using numerical models. This is often backed up by genetic testing that checks for certain recessive variants. With this method, choices can be made based on facts instead of social shame. It stresses chance, difference, and the fact that many children from the same family are healthy. The story from Indiana is very different from this one. In 1913, there was no such thing as this kind of therapy. Instead, families were judged by what other people thought and what was in the news. There was no more uncertainty, there was only sure, and there was no longer any nuance. Numbers make things clear, and they also show that the claim in the title is false. There is no way to figure out the risk, the coefficient of inbreeding, or the genetic process behind a child turning 70 years old in 7 days. Probability can explain how diseases really work, but not how stories work. The headline from Indiana didn't offer numbers, but a metaphor. It made fears of inherited decline more dramatic by picturing the worst thing that could happen. On the other hand, science is based on the real world of percentages, increments, and possibilities. We can see how far from the truth the sensational story was by turning genetics into numbers. Risk is real, but it is limited, can be measured, and is well known. Genetics is based on probability, not on certainty. Numbers don't show horror or punishment, they show chance, variation, and results that are spread out on a scale. In Indiana in 1913, the public wasn't given this clarity. Instead, they were given headlines that turned odds into stories. Going over the math of heredity again shows how different culture myths are from scientific facts. This difference shows why the story of 70 years in a week could never have been true. A method of critical asking is the best way to deal with a claim that seems so unlikely, like a child turning 70 years old in a week. The first thing to check is to see if any known conditions fit the timeline given. Even the worst progeroid diseases get worse over the course of months or years. Conditions like Hutchinson, Guilford progeria, mandibulo-acral dysplasia, Cockayne syndrome, and xeroderma pigmentosum all show changes slowly over time that can be seen. None of them have ever been shown to cause sudden changes in just a few days. This simple fact, that the timeline doesn't match up right away, shows that the Indiana story can't fit with any known biological truth. The second question is whether the given theory is based on mechanisms and fits with what we know about genetics. Finding mechanisms, or the steps that causes take to have impacts, is how science moves forward. A certain variation in the LMNA gene causes progerin to be made, which is a harmful protein that makes cells less stable. Xeroderma pigmentosum happens when DNA repair systems that usually fix damage caused by UV light don't work right. These steps are clear and can be done again and again. The Indiana headline, on the other hand, didn't give a plausible explanation. It said that the change happened because of inbreeding, which was a broad charge that didn't explain how biological processes could turn decades into days. The claim isn't scientific because it doesn't have a mechanical reason, it's more like a story. The third question is whether the claim is backed up by any relevant verifiable sources. Medical cases that are trustworthy leave behind records like hospital files, coroner's reports, scientific papers, or in-depth family testimonies. Professionals pay attention to cases that are out of the ordinary. In the early 1900s, doctors were quick to report strange finds, especially if they could help the study of inheritance. However, there is no such evidence in the Indiana case. There are no records of the story in professional literature, it only lives on in shocking news stories and retellings. This lack tells us a lot. If what happened really happened, there would have been some record that wasn't in the hands of journalists. These three questions about the timing, the mechanism, and the source make it easy to evaluate any crazy claim. They show the difference between what doctors know and what people believe. It was hard to give a timeline for the Indiana case because there was no mechanism and the sources were at best anecdotal. What's left is a story that was more like a tale than a report. It was culturally useful because it fed fears about relatedness and supported eugenic ideas, but it wasn't based on biological facts. Using these questions also brings up the bigger problem of how people use extraordinary claims. A lot of the time, people don't look closely at sensational news because they just confirm what they already think. Indiana in 1913 was a place where people were already ready to believe in genetic disaster. A story that played up those fears didn't need much proof to get people's attention. It didn't matter that the story didn't make medical sense, it was convincing enough for its societal purpose. This contradiction is shown when we ask the right questions, which reminds us that plausibility depends on both how well it fits with facts and how well it fits with culture. This system is still useful now. Strange claims keep going around, and the media often plays them up to get more attention. The same practice is needed to judge them. Does the schedule match up with how things usually work? Is the theory based on mechanisms and in line with what scientists already know? Can the story be backed up by independent sources from the time? Applying these standards to many stories makes them fall apart, giving us a better picture of how and why they spread. This idea is clearly shown by the Indiana story. These questions were too close for it to stand up to, but it did well because few people asked them. The lesson isn't just about the past, it's also about why we should always be skeptical. Extraordinary claims need more than just being accepted without question, they need to be carefully looked over. In 1913, the lack of such an investigation let a story grow. Now that people have better access to science information, the same tools can stop people from making the same mistake again. By asking basic, well-thought-out questions, you can avoid falling for sensationalism and make sure that stories about genes are seen as biological facts rather than moral lessons. The Indiana title falls apart under the weight of its own errors when you get right down to it. Biology doesn't allow for changes to happen that quickly. This means that a child can't turn 70 and still be alive. Aging is a process that happens over time and is affected by DNA repair, cellular wear, and metabolic control. It is linked to the passing of years even when it is sped up by rare diseases. Some conditions, like Hutchinson, Guilford progeria, or mandibulo-acral dysplasia, cause symptoms that look like old age, but they happen slowly and reliably, not all of a sudden. Everything we know about how the body grows and ages is at odds with the main idea of the story. The second mistake is thinking that this kind of thing is caused by inbreeding. Not being related to someone with a Progeroid syndrome causes it. Instead, certain genetic changes do. These mutations often happen on their own in children whose parents do not have the syndrome. Progeria is usually caused by a single letter change in the LMNA gene, which makes progerin, a form of lamin A, that doesn't work right. This mutation happens by chance almost all the time, which means it has nothing to do with family relatedness. If you blame family ties for conditions that happen by chance, you're not telling the truth about science and you're spreading stigma instead of knowledge. Even in cases where being related to someone increases the risk, the results are usually only a small increase in the chance of recessive conditions, not the crazy situations that make the news. The third mistake has to do with culture instead of biology. The statement doesn't show medical facts, it shows how eugenics affected Indiana in the early 1900s. The state passed the first law in the country that required people to get sterilized. This reinforced the idea that social worth was based on genes. By 1913, people were used to hearing warnings about decline and degeneration. Contests like the Better Babies at state fairs made this talk stronger. In this situation, stories about disasters that run in the family were not only fun, they were also comforting. The boy who reportedly aged 70 years in a week became a symbol of what eugenicists said the government should do to stop this. Even though the story didn't make sense, it was still useful as a warning. All of these things, biological impossibility, science error, and cultural exaggeration, together show how myths spread. The Indiana title never said anything about a real event. It was about supporting a story that genetics were weak, that being related was dangerous, and that society should control reproduction. This way, the story served its purpose, even though it wasn't based on real events. People remembered the lesson more than the specifics, and the link between inbreeding and genetic disaster lived on long after the story itself was no longer published. These flaws are easy to see in light of modern research. Genetics has come a long way, and now we fully understand how progeroid diseases work. It is known and can be predicted how these disorders will get worse, and the role of de novo mutations is also well established. The humility and limits of probability models are shown by the fact that they can only measure the risks that come with being related. According to Study into the Past, the headline comes from a time when eugenics was popular and news stories that made genetics seem scary were popular. From this angle, it's clear that the information is wrong. But the fact that the story was wrong is exactly what makes it interesting. It shows how medical ignorance, cultural fear, and news stories that tried to make people feel good all came together to make myths that changed how people thought. It shows how prejudice can take the place of science when words like inbred are given more weight than facts. A good example of how headlines can get ahead of the truth and cause confusion long after the facts are forgotten. The Indiana story may not have been based on a real child, but it caught the worries of the time so well that it has become a cultural artifact. Every shocking news story about heredity has a real-life human story behind it. Whether it's a family dealing with a rare disease, a community looking for answers, or a society putting its worries onto biology. The 1913 story from Indiana, about a boy who turned 70 years old in a week because of inbreeding, says more about the fears and ideas of the time than it does about science. It used culture bias, eugenics rhetoric, and the desire for news stories with a lot of action to turn an impossible medical claim into a story about how people's health gets worse over time. It took away the complexity by replacing chance with certainty and turning a kid, real or imagined, into a symbol instead of a person. The science makes it clear that the stated change is not caused by any disorder. Syndromes like progeria get worse over years, not days. A lot of cases happen on their own, not because they are related. When relatives get married, the risks do go up, but not by huge amounts. The increases are small and easy to measure. The lies that were spread in the early 1900s are very different from these facts. They tell us that genes are a matter of chance, not fate, and that the words we use to talk about these chances affect how we understand them. There is a difference between being related and inbreeding. There is also a difference between science and shame, and between accuracy and opinion. The story also shows how cultural factors affect how medical claims are taken seriously. The idea of eugenics was already against the law in Indiana. There were contests, campaigns, and speeches in public that praised fit families and warned against decline. A story about a genetic disaster wasn't thrown out as silly, it was taken as proof. People believed myths because they supported what they were already told. When we know this, we can see the story not as a strange one-off, but as part of a bigger way of thinking that connected biology to morals, health to worth, and heredity to social control. Not only does remembering this past help fix scientific mistakes, but it also helps people understand how stigma affects people. When families were called inbred, they were blamed, even if their children's illnesses had nothing to do with being related. Sensational stories made that load even heavier, turning them into cautionary tales instead of people who needed care. By looking at the Indiana story again with more scientific knowledge, we can get rid of the stigma and show that behind every myth is a family trying to deal with the unknowns of biology. Thanks for reading this look at a story that shows how fear, misinformation, and the desire for attention can change the truth. If you want to hear more about history, science, and the myths that shaped them, you might want to subscribe to help fund more studies told in the same calm and factual way.